Good morning. My name is Keith Little, and I'm on the governing board of Camp Aranzazu, and I'm pleased to be here with you this morning for Camp Aranzazu's Saturday Story Time, which is part of our Good Times Never End programming this summer. But before we start, we really need you to have permission to watch this video from an adult. So if you haven't done that yet, please pause the video and go ask an adult and come back to restart it. I'll give you a minute. Thank you. Let's begin. The book I'm going to be reading today is called Paddle to the Sea. This book was written by Clancy Holling, a really unusual name, but a very popular author. And he wrote this book in 1941. It's very beautifully illustrated, which is why it received a Caldecott Award. If you ever see this medallion on the front of a book, you know that the illustrations inside are very beautiful. This book is appropriate for readers about age 10 and higher. If you're younger than 10, some of the vocabulary in here may be a little challenging, and maybe you'll need to have an adult read it to you. It's somewhat long, 27 chapters. But the chapters are short, so here's a typical chapter. There's text on one page and a beautiful illustration on the other page, and so you'll be able to get through it pretty quickly. I'm going to read a summary of the book, and then my wife, Julie, is going to read one chapter, and then I'm going to read two other chapters, and you'll probably want to get the book and read the rest. I'm going to leave this copy at Camp Aranzazu, so if you're there next summer, go look for it. So the summary of the story is found here on the inside cover. In the Nipigon country north of the Great Lakes, a young boy carved the figure of an Indian in a canoe. We have canoes at Camp Aranzazu, as you probably know. He christened him Paddle to the Sea and set him on a melting snowbank which the spring sun was turning into a tumbling mountain stream. Then Paddle began a journey that took him hundreds of miles from his birthplace. He escaped the jaws of a hungry sawmill and went on to see many things on his long trip through the Great Lakes and down the St. Lawrence Seaway. Wild animals fleeing a forest fire, the wreck of a ship caught in an icy winter storm on Lake Superior, loading, unloading at busy docks, peaceful farms bordering the St. Lawrence. He took a dizzying plunge over Niagara Falls and managed by a miracle to survive the whirlpools. He was buffeted by many winds and currents and was helped on his way by human hands until at last he reached the Atlantic Ocean and earned the right to be called a true paddle to the sea. So let me explain a couple things. This young Indian boy carved a canoe, and the name Indian was used back in 1941 when Mr. Hollins wrote this book. But nowadays we more commonly say Native American or Native Canadian. And then let me describe the Great Lakes to you in case you're not familiar with them. There's a beautiful illustration in the back. Sorry about that. In the back of the book that shows the 5 Great Lakes that sit between the United States and Canada. The United States is in red on the bottom, Canada is in yellow on the top. And the 5 Great Lakes are Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, and Lake Erie. And then coming out of Lake Erie is the St. Lawrence River, or St. Lawrence Seaway, that leads into the Atlantic Ocean. So that was the journey that Paddle to the Sea took, from Lake Superior through the other lakes, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean.
Sea came to be. The Canadian wilderness was white with snow. From Lake Superior northward, the evergreen trees wore hoods of coats of white. A heavy blanket of snow hung low across the hills. There was no sound. Nothing moved. Even a thread of gray smoke stood up like a pole, keeping the sky from falling on a log cabin in the valley. Here's the log cabin, and there's the smoke. It looks like a pole. Then, far off, a sound began. It grew louder, louder, and swept overhead in a wild cackle of honks and cries. "Geese!" cried the Indian boy, standing in the door of the cabin. "They came back too soon. I must hurry to finish my paddle person." This is what he's calling his paddle person. He returned to his bear robe by the fire, where he had sat for many days, whittling a piece of pine. Now he worked on in silence. He bent over the fire to melt lead in an iron spoon and poured it out to cool and harden in the hollow of the wood. He fastened a piece of tin to one end of the carving. Then he brought out oil paints and worked carefully with a brush. Here's the tin on the end of the canoe. Satisfied at last, the boy sat back on his heels. Before him lay a canoe 1 foot long. Here it is. It looked like his father's big birch bark loaded with packs and supplies for a journey. Underneath was a tin rudder. Here it is. To keep it headed forward, and a lump of lead for ballast. This would keep the canoe low in the water and turn it right side up after an upset. An Indian figure knelt just back of the middle, grasping a paddle, and along the bottom were carved these words: "Please put me back in the water. I am paddle to the sea." So the Indian boy named his figure Paddle to the Sea.
So the next chapter we're going to read is chapter 10, and it's called Life in a Northern Marsh. And the reason I picked this chapter is because we have a very significant marsh at Camp Aransas, and many of the animals that you will hear mentioned in this chapter, we also have at Camp Aransas. In fact, many of the birds that spend the winter in our marsh at Camp Aransas or around us spend the summers up north in marshes like this. So this is chapter 10, Life in a Northern Marsh. The marsh was alive. Dragonflies and butterflies danced in the sun. Turtles lay in rows like buttons on the old logs. And frogs, frightened by stalking herons, leaped in all directions. The downy babies of wild ducks pecked eagerly at bugs. Woodpeckers, kingfishers, and ruffed grouse made their busy noises. A cow moose with her calf splashed in the lagoon to drive off the flies. Near Paddle, a bull moose, now growing new antlers, was feeding on the roots and stems of water lilies. With his head far underwater, he jerked the lily pad from under Paddle's canoe and set him free to be pushed about on the pond by the wind. Days passed. When it was sunny, squirrels chattered in the pines and chipmunks scolded from high rocks. But they were silent, and the ducks moved to safety on the day that a mother bear and her twins came to romp in the water. The cubs caught crayfish and frogs in the mud, while the mother bear squatted on a rock beside a deep pool in the lagoon and smacked a bass on the bank with her paw. After this picnic, all three ripped open rotted stumps for grubs and beetles. Paddle was stuck in the marsh. He might have been caught in the marsh for the rest of his life. But one evening, no stars came out. Thunder crashed, kind of like it is around here today. And lightning split the night with fire. A wet owl flapped madly for shelter in the forest. Ducks squawked and gathered their babies under mossy banks. A water-soaked muskrat waddled wetly into a hollow log and sat down with a very sour look. The rain made a thick curtain. The pond rose inch by inch. Part of the sand dune along the brook gave way. Torn lily plants, loose wood, and islands of watercress raced out to Lake Superior. Paddle was again on his way to the sea. Our final chapter that we're going to read today from Paddle to the Sea is 23, and this deals with Paddle to the Sea's journey over the Niagara Falls. The Niagara Falls separate Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and they are one of the most spectacular waterfalls in the world. I selected this chapter because the waterfalls and all of the angry water at the bottom of the waterfalls reminds me of Copano Bay, where Camp Aranzazu is located. Usually, Copano Bay is flat and peaceful, but when a storm comes through, and in particular a hurricane, the water is very turbulent, the waves are high, and that reminded me of Paddle to the Sea's experience going over Niagara Falls. So, chapter 23. You can see a picture over here of him going over the falls. This is him right here, and these are all the waves. The lower half of Niagara Falls was hidden in mist with a rainbow across it. Paddle fell through the rainbow and went on falling. There was a swirling, boiling, hissing, churning, and then Paddle went under. Paddle had ridden rapids. There had been his first creek back in the forest, wild enough for its size. Then he had ridden a mad river, and he had seen the rapids at the Sioux, so fierce that ships went around them. But these rapids, 30-foot waves rushed like shooting stars, turning inside out at every jump. Paddle flew up on a chain of wet volcanoes, plunged deep in submarine dives, and took sudden trips towards the moon in green rockets. Far from the falls, he finally came to the surface, rolling over and over and down the Niagara River into a whirlpool where it seemed like all the water in the Great Lakes suddenly decided to run back uphill. Paddle bumped into huge trees that had whirled and around, unable to escape for years. But by some miracle, he got past this never-stop merry-go-round after only a day, or maybe it was a week. And then at last, he floated into the calm waters of Lake Ontario. Black ducks and white seagulls looked him over. Kindly people picked him up. Someone took him to Toronto, someone else to Kingston, and someone else through the Thousand Islands. Then finally, the dizzying fall over Niagara was behind him, and the Atlantic Ocean was ahead. The end. Thank you very much for joining us in this reading of Paddle to the Sea, and join us next Saturday for Camperanzu's Saturday Story Time.